to talk for 20.
Hello.
Okay, and she aim for Q&A.
Hi. I'm Vivek. I'm going to be talking about something that I've been working on with my team Cursive called digital pheromones. And the overall kind of affordance here is using MPC or multi-party computation for human connection and coordination. So I want to start with kind of trying to define this as we see it so far. And for that, I want to introduce first what is multi-party computation. So this is essentially where multiple parties can come together. They each have private data that they keep to themselves, and they jointly compute the output of some sort of function, such that only the output of the function is revealed and nothing intermediary or nothing about their actual inputs themselves. It's actually a fairly old technique. A lot of the stuff that people are currently using dates back to the 80s, 1986, and yeah, has just gotten a lot faster and more performant in the past few decades. I also want to introduce biological pheromones, if that's unfamiliar for any folks. It's a chemical substance produced by an animal, and it's generally used to basically get individuals of the same species to coordinate or work together in some sort of way. And there's a bunch of different options, bunch of different ways this happens. For bees, for example, it's about sort of setting off a signal and bringing a whole swarm of bees to come together in one place. A lot of animals mark their territory using scents. And there's also a lot of sexual pheromones for different animals to aid in their mating. So digital pheromones kind of comes from combining these two different ideas, and I think I would define it in three principles, at least right now as we sort of played with it. The first is that this pheromone is a very lightweight and privacy-preserving signal. It shouldn't be very heavy. Ideally, it can just be transferred across something like Bluetooth or some sort of low-energy network. And we use it just to discover connection and perform coordination, very similar to how this works biologically. Another requirement or kind of principle is that this stuff is fully programmable and verifiable. You can choose what conditions you want to reveal, and also because we have amazing tech from ZK Land, you can basically ensure that a lot of different stuff is actually verified, so that people aren't putting out sort of false pheromones and essentially getting connection when they shouldn't be. And I think a final requirement for this to really feel almost a part of nature, as a biological pheromone is that this stuff happens in kind of a neutral peer-to-peer cryptographic protocol. We don't want this to be kind of within the ecosystem of a single app. It should be something where you can use whatever front end and app you want, but there's sort of some sort of standard between them to be able to communicate and coordinate. And ideally, we don't need a server for coordination. If a server can help in a way that's still privacy preserving, but can sort of make UX better, I think that's fine. And broadly, we think digital pheromones can help in two types of sort of human connection, discoverability and improving depth of connection. So with discoverability, a lot of our current stuff is based on AI algorithms and advertising markets who basically have all of your personal data from what you do on the app. And their objectives are to keep you on the app for as long as possible and to maximize the amount of money you're spending. With something like digital pheromones and the suite of cryptographic tools it's built on, we get to a place where we can have full ownership over our own data using tools like signatures and ZKPs, and use stuff like MPC to have these sort of really safe, programmable, controllable interfaces to learn more about the people you're interacting with. And in terms of depth of connection, I think right now in the current version of the web, there's basically no verifiability on a lot of data. You kind of just trust public profiles as they are. And as a result, there just isn't much depth. And the other kind of twist of this is that oftentimes these profiles are very sort of public, sanitized versions of who we are. We're kind of playing to whatever game we think the algorithm will like or what other people will like. With something like digital pheromones, it opens up a world where you can actually have all this stuff be verified and provable. And because you are custodying it privately, you have control over how it's used, ideally you can share more interesting and deeper personal information and thus facilitate better connection, better matches, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, using tools like MPC and this tool called a private set intersection or PSI that I'll introduce, you can do this in a very safe and just sort of efficient way. Cool, so I want to just go through a bunch of different kind of use cases or general sort of features that we think this sort of thing could enable, some of which we've built out, some of which we're still trying to figure out how we can make efficient. It just needs more research and stuff. So the first is this idea of narrowcasting. So narrowcasting is the opposite of a broadcast. And the idea here is that you can basically choose a set of criteria that you want information to be reached, choose a set of criteria for people that you want this information to get to. For example, if you're throwing a really exclusive party, You can basically find people that are in your city and find people that have certain other connections and certain other stuff. And the cool thing about it is that this information is just like encrypted nonsense to people who don't match this. But for people who do, they can decrypt it and see this information. And the idea here is that this can basically enable more efficient and also like, you can keep this sort of criteria private to yourself. So basically like a better interface to get information to people versus just like depending on an algorithm to do this for you. Another one is this idea of unbreakable consent. So in multi-party computation, there's a general sort of like flaw or bug, which is that in this computation, someone can always drop out of the process. And this can either like break the whole computation, or potentially they can get the result of the computation and leave before other people do. I think in the context of more like human-facing stuff, and especially for something like 2PC, this I think actually is a feature. Basically, you need full consent across all the different parties for anything to be like verified or like revealed. And so I think basically you can build a system in which consent is literally like mathematically baked in instead of just depending on the platform or other things to do that for you. Another idea is the idea of superconnectors. So essentially the idea here is that, again, like algorithms, like stuff like Tinder and Hinge are being used to basically sort of bring people together, match them on different criteria. And they're kind of this like overlord that works with whatever incentives they want. And we think this technology potentially could have the benefit of letting humans be those connectors for each other. So you can sort of receive like privacy preserving like summaries of your friend's data in a way that's sort of like still private, but you can still do computation over. And then you can basically just be like, hey, you two should meet, or you two like have a lot in common in a way that's like basically going through like a mutual friend instead of through an algorithm, but still maintains privacy. A couple of the quick ones. I think basically this generally allows for like more direct connection between two different parties, in particular for businesses who are trying to do something like ads. This can just happen, this coordination can happen directly instead of like someone like Facebook custodying all the data, like providing the market and sort of taking a cut from that. This other feature that we're hoping to build soon is basically something like I'm feeling serendipitous, where you can just walk into a public space, you can like put out a bunch of different sort of like privacy preserving signals of the sort of people you want to meet, the sort of things you want to do. And like I guess the upshot of this is that you can just sort of like privately manifest like the kinds of people, the kinds of things that you want to do in the moment, in a physical space. And because it's all digital, you can just send this over the internet as well through like encrypted channels. Finally, like another one that's like a personal favorite of mine is like, because this stuff is peer-to-peer, very lightweight, you can imagine just sort of like putting this out, these signals out to your community, to your like neighbors. And there's all sorts of like little like small coordination stuff you could do with your neighbors that would be super useful, that maybe it doesn't make sense to all join the same social app and like, put a bunch of information up, but on some sort of more neutral protocol, for example, you could do things like, oh, like someone else is like looking for the same grocery or the same like other item, like I'll just pick up some extras and then give it to them. If you need help with certain like house repairs or certain things, like you can just query like, hey, like who nearby like knows how to do this thing, and generally just like discover fun overlaps and intersections with the people who live close to you as a way to more easily connect. Cool. So now this will progress into sort of the more technical part of this talk, which is basically just what sorts of actual cryptographic tools are we using here to build this sort of thing. I'm going to go through some past stuff and then some upcoming stuff as well. So the first one is something called private set intersection. This is a really classic cryptographic technique. And the overall kind of like affordance here is that you can basically discover commonalities in a way that doesn't reveal anything else. And you can apply this to anything from just like a ordered set to just like arbitrary data. And so, for example, like people can just attest to different interests and then in a very, very efficient cryptographic interaction, discover only what they have in common. And this can also basically expand from just two parties to be a group of parties for coordination sort of things. Like, for example, Calendly is sort of some like weak private, like not Calendly, I guess, like Let Us Meet and these sorts of things are kind of like a weak PSI where you like manually enter your stuff and you see everyone's availability. So I think some nice things about PSI is that it is using privacy in an offensive way, which is that basically you can put out a bunch of data about yourself and the only things that are going to be revealed are what you have in common with other people. And just in general, like I think the risk of sort of negative side effects for something like this are much lower because at the very worst case, even if it is something like weird or personal, it's like shared by the other person. And this contrasts with tools like zero knowledge proofs where actually the goal is to share as minimally as possible. You want to basically only reveal what you need to and then hide everything else. I think PSI is also very conceptually easy to explain. I think like out of all the different cryptography that I've worked on, this is the one that like a general person, layperson can pick up and understand the fastest. But at the same time, it's a very like rigid protocol. It's like quite simple. It's not very expressive. And often in these sorts of like matching and discovery things, you want to do more complex operations. So that takes us to a second tool that we've been working around with, which is multi-party FHE, or fully homomorphic encryption. And I'd say the general sort of improvement here is that for especially consumer devices that are involved in this process, there's a much like lower liveness and compute necessary than for a lot of other types of MPC. So the general kind of flow of how this works is that, I guess like a little bit of a primer in FHE, you essentially can have like some sort of key that you can encrypt data to. You can do operations on the encrypted data, and then when you decrypt this, it's as if you did the same operations on like the plain text data. And so in this case, how we make that work in a multi-party setting is that there's 3 phases. The first is that Alice and Bob, or any sort of group of people, come together and create a collective public key. This is done in a way that none of them know the corresponding secret key, so all of them can encrypt data to this public key, and they know that no one else will be able to decrypt it within their party. So once they've all sort of encrypted to the same key, you can now do operations across it. And so now you can take different people's data, and you can do whatever operation it is, like literally anything you could define, and get to some encrypted output. And then finally, because no one actually knows the secret key, which you need to be able to decrypt this, you need to do like a collective MPC to basically do this decryption. And like in this case, this is literally just building a PSI with this multi-party FHE, which is actually something that we've done in the past. There's a really nice sort of like toolkit called Ring Learning with Errors that essentially enables really efficient private set intersections on like an ordered set. And so this is something that we've built out in the past, works really nicely. However, there's still a bunch of rounds here in that the parties need to come together on every single computation to make this shared key at the beginning and come together at the end. There's this new approach that was pioneered by Gauss Labs, which essentially can remove this sort of first step of the process. Everyone uploads just a public key, and a server handles the process of essentially creating a shared like collective key. And then everyone can encrypt to that, and then you still have this sort of collective decryption process at the end, but you can skip this first step, which is really, really nice for a lot of applications. So one thing we built on top of this was at Frontiers, conference in SF, we basically built this sort of like private job matching setup, where essentially, as a job candidate, you might want to have privacy over the fact that you're looking for a job and like what kind of salary you're looking for, especially if you're currently employed somewhere. You don't want to like mess up relationships. But at the same time, you should be able to find the best stuff that's out there. And so what you can do is you can essentially encrypt your own job profile. You can attach ZKPs for verification, all that stuff. And if other people also basically make postings that are private, which maybe you want for like some sort of stealth role or generally just like don't have to put this data up publicly, you can basically discover overlap in this, both in terms of like the sorts of characteristics of the job and what the candidate wants, as well as like salary, which is a more private thing of like the recruiter is willing to pay this much and below, whereas the candidate is willing to work for like this much and above. And you can just discover overlap in that without, revealing those numbers too early on. Some really nice things about multi-party FHE is that the actual computation involved here can basically just be fully offloaded to a server. And so as a result of that, devices only need to do generation of public keys and uploading that, and then doing encryption of their data. At least the latter is a very cheap operation, and the first one is a one-time thing. The unfortunate thing is that there's actually still quite a bit of back and forth rounds involved in this sort of thing, where there is still this kind of final decryption step, which can make for really weird both UX and DevX. And finally, unfortunately with a lot of this stuff, at least in its current state, the data blow up here is immense, where the public keys you're using, the different encrypted data, grows in size a lot. Because essentially you're adding a bunch of like sort of noise to this data while still preserving its structure. And as a result of that, there's a really big blow up that can be in the like tens to hundreds of megabytes, which just doesn't really work for most applications. Cool, so I want to talk about a new research result that was built in-house called Trinity, which we think answers a lot of these different questions. In particular, it's an instance of a general form of computation called non-interactive secure computation, with an added bonus that it's all verifiable. At least the inputs, their properties can be verifiable. It's a combination of, it's named this way because it's a combination of 3 different schemes. The first is Garbled Circuits, which is a very classical technique. KZG Witness Encryption, which actually came out this year. Really, really beautiful paper, very simple result, but very powerful. And finally, good old PLONK, or any sort of like KZG-based ZK snark that's not Groth16, because Groth16 is like weird. So just a brief primer on each of these things. Garbled circuits basically enable 2 different parties, at least in the classical setting, to compute some sort of function. And there's this initial sort of like phase where one person sends over a garbling of the circuit, which is basically like a version of it that is sort of like hidden and like encrypted in a way, and they sort of encrypt their own inputs into this. But then the other person, in this case Bob, he needs to know his own encrypted inputs. And so these two parties engage in what's called an oblivious transfer, which basically Alice can send Bob's encrypted inputs without learning what Bob's actual inputs are, and without Bob learning what the other encrypted inputs would be. And this oblivious transfer technique, unfortunately, has a bunch of back and forth rounds. So it gets us to about the same place in terms of rounds as like multi-party FHE. The nice thing is this very recent result basically saves the day in that you can essentially, I'm not going to go into the mathematical details, but the high level is that you can essentially create a constant size commitment to all of your different data and post it once. You can post it on the blockchain because it's so tiny. And other people can essentially encrypt inputs to this commitment. And so as a result, this is all a bunch of like the math behind this, you can basically make the oblivious transfer one round. And so as a result, you can just send it with the garbling. And the upshot of this is that to do a 2PC with somebody else, I just need to send them one message instead of having a bunch of like back and forth communication. Finally, the really nice thing is this commitment is a KZG commitment, which means that you can use other really, really powerful tools like PLONK to basically verify different properties of this. And because so much amazing engineering work and theoretical work has gone into this, this can be really, really efficient. And so you get basically both this sort of one-round computation, but then all the inputs, you can basically have a proof that they satisfy different properties. And yeah, so as I mentioned, basically there's just one round of data transfer, and you have these like succinct, very efficient validity proofs of all these inputs, and actually Alice's inputs as well. And so we think this can basically enable a really simple DevX and UX for building consumer 2PC apps, and hopefully like more parties in that as well with some more research. Again, you can use sort of other verifiable data, and maybe the overall way to describe this is that you can basically just send like, this is actually very similar to like narrowcasting. It's like kind of almost the same concept of, you basically send like one encrypted email, and the other person is only going to be able to open it if they sort of match whatever criteria or whatever like function you set there. And so there's stuff from like hiring, dating, like event promotion that we think could be used, could be built on this sort of thing and be made a lot more like safe and efficient. One counterpoint I'd like to make is that you might ask, like, why are you doing all this fancy cryptography? Like, you can just use secure hardware, which will do it way easier. And honestly, that's pretty fair. But I think, at least in the context of this idea of digital pheromones, I think secure hardware is very not neutral, and it's also very not peer-to-peer. And that you have a server entity that is basically hosting this stuff for you, and you need to trust them that they're doing the right thing. And also, like, if they are cut out of the process, or they censor you, or they otherwise just like are not accessible, you're basically just screwed. And I think cryptography enables something that is much more peer-to-peer, interoperable, can be sort of like a neutral network, very, very akin to like, natural pheromones. Cool, so where can you actually try this stuff? So first off, if you go downstairs, Cursive has a really, really nice booth near the registration desk, like right after it, next to the badge creation station. And you can try a couple of these different things. So first off is private set intersection. You can basically, you get these little NFC chips, and you can create a profile around that, and you can start tapping and meeting other people and building a little social graph. And then if you import other types of data, which includes like some connections to GitHub or your Devcon events or like different sort of like forms you can fill out, you can basically do this private set intersection process and discover commonalities. And we're hoping to add a few more data entries over the course of this week. So this can be more interesting. Another nice thing we just added recently is that basically as you do more and more PSI and as you learn more and more about different people, there's sort of this little digital flower. And the more and more you have in common and the more you discover about each other, this little guy grows. And so you can end the event with basically this garden of connections, each of which is basically representing of, how much you sort of have learned about each other or otherwise shared. You were promised a live demo today. I'm so sorry. It is so close to being done. And later in the week, this will actually just be uploaded into the app. And so there'll be this sort of digital pheromones tab at the end of, or like in one of the like parts of the app where you can essentially do this whole process. You can send out queries, you can receive them, and you can also like, with this idea of unbreakable consent, no one is going to learn that you matched with it until you basically opt into it. And so at the very least, we're going to try to just run back this job matching stuff, and ideally we can add some more fun stuff over the week. A couple of the shout outs. So this booth that I mentioned is actually modeled in the form of a museum exhibition called Cryptographic Connections. It's both a bunch of art pieces and educational content about how cryptography can connect us both with present tools and also with stuff from the past. And again, it's right behind registration next to the badge station. And in addition, over the next few days, we're going to be running this cryptographic classroom. We have a bunch of like blackboards in the back of our booth, and I'm hoping to basically both get to explain all this research in a lot more detail to anyone who's interested, as well as just explain classic cryptography constructions. I really like teaching people about cryptography. It helps me understand it better. Right now, this is going to be running from Thursday and Friday from 10:30 to 12 p.m. We'll maybe do more sessions if there's more interest. Just come by the booth and express that you want other times, and we can probably make it happen. A quick shout out for Cursive. We're exploring all sorts of different research and design work around cryptography for human connection, and this is just sort of one of those explorations. And come by our booth if you want to learn about past stuff we've built. And finally, a really big shout out to Privacy and Scaling Explorations, which is a sub-team of the Ethereum Foundation. Our team is grant funded by them, and we've been able to do a lot of really great research and exploratory work, both on our own and also with collaborating with other researchers in the ecosystem. And if you want to learn more about Cursive, here are some links for you to take. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vivek. We have some great questions rolling in. Let's take the first one. What prevents bad actors from interacting over the host search space to recover preference data?
That's a great question. I think ZK proofs are the main tool here, so that basically, like, you can require on the most important stuff that the attributes that someone has is actually ZK proven, and so as a result, it's like much harder to basically just kind of like fish for information. The difficult thing here is that a lot of stuff is just self-attested, and so there's other sort of like out-of-band things like rate limiting, or maybe ensuring that you only get queries from like a friend or like a friend of a friend, to ensure that you aren't just getting like spammed and kind of like read in a way.
All right, and is there any SDK library I can use to build out an MPC/FHE?
Yes, so the main toolkit that we use to build out the hiring flow and a bunch of other experiments is called Phantom Zone. This is a multi-party FHE toolkit built by Gauss Labs, mostly Janmajaya, and some other collaborators from within PSE. This is a really great toolkit. I think its performance, bandwidth, all this sort of stuff is getting improved, but it's very great. In terms of MPC, generally, there's a lot of great tooling coming from Privacy and Scaling Explorations, like a toolkit to basically write circuits in TypeScript called Summon. There's a garbled circuit library called MPZ, which is used by the TLS Notary team. Both of these are going to be what Trinity is built on in the long term, so that it's very easy to maintain and improve. But yeah, those are my current recs.
Perfect. And how do you reason about incentives to report things honestly? If interest matching with PSI, reporting every possible interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for a lot of stuff, like there's sort of like a humanistic layer to this where like you don't really benefit from lying in a sense. Like you might as well just put what you are interested in, and then you will actually just genuinely get matched with that. Obviously, there is sort of this still attack where people can just like say they're interested in everything, and then just be like, wow, we like the exact same things. So it's difficult for a lot of the self-attested stuff, and potentially there's other ways of doing it where like you limit it to just like your top 3 interests or something, like on like a query level. But yeah.
All right, I think we have enough time to take 2 more questions. What is the operational bandwidth or footprint overhead multiplicator for MPC, FHE, MPC? Right.
So basically, I'll talk about the interactive setting, because I guess that's what this is asking. There's this initial MPC, which requires, I think, like O of n squared, different messages being sent. Well, actually, yes, I think that's correct. It's O of n squared messages being sent to set up this collective public key if you want to do it in a peer-to-peer way. Or it's like, I think you can have a server be involved, and then you can lower that to maybe something closer to O of n. But there's that initial MPC. The FHE itself, there's actually no, as far as I understand, no huge performance increase, the fact that you're doing over multiple parties, because you're essentially just doing like single key FHE once you generate this collective key. And then there's also this MPC at the end, which I think is also O of n squared messages. So the more this expands, the worse. With non-interactive, this is a lot better because the server can generate this collective public key by itself, and then can sort of handle that first phase.
Awesome. And how does the creation of collective public key works for more than 2 people trying to share pheromones?
Right. I think, so again, if this is in the like interactive setting, you basically just engage in a like multi-party computation between people, where essentially like you need to generate some like auxiliary data between each other to generate a collective public key, in a way that like neither of you actually get to learn the secret key. There's some really efficient ways to do this for certain schemes. And then if it's more than 2 parties, you basically just expand that with